Today we're going to be learning how to make this sci-fi circuit board looking thingy using Houdini 20.5. I'd seen this tool called jsplacement and it generated these maps that people were using to make these agreeable sci-fi looking things. I don't think that tool is available anymore, but fortunately we can use the COPernicus nodes in Houdini 20.5 to accomplish the same thing. First, we're going to start off by making the base texture, and this is going to be comprised of a whole bunch of different shapes and patterns. And then from there, we're going to separate out anything that we want to have individual control over in shading. So if you look at the photo on the bottom right, you can see that we have the font, and then on the right, we have the different lines, and then we have the dots on the bottom. I wanted to have separate control for that in shading. And so after you have your main displacement, what you're going to do is you're going to save out those additional passes as their own textures. And that way you can have more control in what happens in the next step, which on the left will be shading. And the reason why you have arrows pointing to everything is because this process is sort of a cyclical process. Like it's not just step 1, 2, 3. You're sort of go around the whole process multiple times as you refine the look of what you're trying to make. All right, so I'm going to start by dropping down a geometry node. And I'm going to dive inside and I'm going to create a grid. And for this grid, I want it to have a resolution of 20 by 20. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust that. Then also we're going to want UVs on this grid. So I'll just drop down a UV flatten node and wire that in. Next, I'm going to create a name node. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the path. And the reason why we want to do that is because we're going to be using Solaris to render this. And this is just going to set the path that the primitive is going to show up on stage. And don't worry if that doesn't make sense. It'll make sense in just a moment once we see what's happening. So I'm going to switch this attribute from name to path. And I'm just going to put in the destination path that I want. And usually I put everything in /geo. So I'm just going to type in /geo. And then I'm just going to call it circuit, even though it's not really a circuit board. That's just kind of seems fitting. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And finally, I'm just going to drop down a null. And the reason why is because it's going to make it easy to find where this is. And the reason why it's going to be easy is because we're going to just name this out and then grid. And whenever you're trying to fetch another SOP, if you capitalize the first letter, it'll make it easy to find in the list. So like if I drop down an object merge and I click on this button, you'll see that this shows up first because we use capital letters. All right, so if we're going to be rendering in Solaris, then we're going to need a LOP-net. So I'm going to drop one of those down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually select this node. I'm going to hit Control-C to copy it. And then we can go inside the LOP-net. And I'm going to drop down a SOP import. And we're going to fetch the SOP that we just created. And a cool trick is that you can actually just hit Control-C and Control-V rather, and that'll actually just copy the path. So that's also something else you can do. That's also another cool little trick to get it quickly. And if you see, we're down here, we're getting this little error right here, and we can fix that just by switching this to copy into do active layer. And we can see that warning is now gone. And I'm going to rename this into, let's just call it grid. And if you remember earlier, we were talking about that path attribute. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my workspace over. You can switch it over to Solaris. I just like using this custom preset that I set up, but that's unfortunate. So whenever you switch to Solaris, it'll switch over to stage, but that's not what I want because I want the LOP-net in the geo node that I made. So I'm going to swap back over to that LOP-net. And if I select this node and look at the scene graph view or the scene graph, you'll notice that the path attribute that we created is the destination path where our primitive shows up. So you can see that where that path attribute was geo and then circuit. And so we can see that that's where the primitive lives in our scene. We are going to need a material for this. So let me make sure nothing's selected. And I'm going to drop down a material library rather. And let's go inside, and I'm going to drop down a Karma material builder. And I'm just going to rename this to something. Yeah, that seems fine. And I'm going to hit autofill materials. And here's another neat trick that's really useful when you're using Solaris. So if you hit assign to geometry and you click on this, I find this really frustrating. It's wanting you to click in the viewport, but I rarely find that I want to actually use the viewport for anything when it comes to making selections anyway. So if you hit the control key and then click on this, it actually brings up this picker right here, and then you can go select the primitive that you want. So I'm going to go select the actual geometry right there and hit OK. And so now if we put our display flag on the material library, we have assigned that primitive or a new material. And something else that we're going to want to do, now we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but we know that this is going to be a displacement based shader. So we want to set down a render geometry settings node. And just like all LOP nodes, I don't know why it's doing that. Let me undo that. You have to always choose a primitive that you want to be affected. So again, I'm going to hit control click that, and then I'm going to select our geometry again. And then I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And I'm going to find this where it says dicing. And it says dicing quality. I'm just going to go ahead and set that to 0.5. And I'm keeping it at 0.5 now because it can take a while to do the dicing when you start a render. And so I'm just going to keep it at something a bit lower. But when you actually want to render your final image, you might want to knock that up to like, I don't know, like 1 or 2. But for now, for speed, I'm going to keep that at 0.5. Then we need a camera. And so let me actually close that window. So I'm just going to go here and hit new camera, and I'm going to name it to render cam. That's always my go-to name, render cam. And because we changed the name, it lost the camera. So I'm just going to select it again, and I actually spelled that wrong. There we go. And obviously there's not really any good way to adjust the camera angle because we don't know how it's going to look, but just to get something close, I'm going to make sure that the grid is filling the whole camera. And obviously we can make adjustments later, so I'll just leave that there for now. And now we're going to need some render settings. So I'm going to type in Karma, and it's going to drop down the nodes that we need. So I'm going to wire that in and put the display flag on the render settings node. And I'm just going to save this. Let's see. So we need to do a couple of things here. First of all, I'm going to switch this to 1080p. And let's see. Let's switch over the camera. Right now the camera is on nothing. So if I switch it over to render cam, that'll fix that other issue. And then we can switch this over to XPU. And then the last thing that we're going to want to do is go over to the geometry and shading, and then go to dicing. And then we're going to choose our dicing camera. And we're going to select just our render cam right there. And this dicing quality scale right there, that's actually just a multiplier on this parameter right here. It looks like that's pretty much everything that we need. And so the only other thing that we're going to need is a COPnet, because that's where we're going to make the actual material. So I'm going to drop that down, and we're going to move on to the next section. Now it's time to build the actual texture that we're going to be using for displacement. I switched my workspace back over to build, and so now I'm going to go inside the COPnet. I'm going to start off by creating a SOP import. The goal here is to scatter a whole bunch of points on a grid and then take those points into COPernicus and then stamp a whole bunch of squares on them. So I'm going to name this base because this is going to be our base level of detail. And let's go inside, and I'm going to drop down a grid. If you think about it, right now in the viewport, we're working in 3D space, but when we bring this into COPernicus, COPernicus is 2D space. And so we want our 3D geometry to match up properly in 2D. And so because of that, we're going to need to work in pretty much UV space. And so since there are 2 dimensions, that's going to be the X and Y dimension, and the Z axis is the third one. So let's switch over to X and Y. And now we're going to be working in the correct space, but we need to also, I'm just going to put down a reverse really quickly just so it's facing the right way. But there's something else that I wanted to bring up. If we're truly working in UV space, then we need to be working in 0 to 1, because if you think about it, I hit space 5 to bring the UV viewport up. If you think about it, when you work in UV space, you're typically working in a range of 0 to 1. So like right here on the bottom left would be 0, 0, and then up here at the top right, it would be 1, 1. So I'm going to drop down a UV flatten so that we can actually have some UVs. And let's go ahead and set this from 10 to 10. We're going to set this to 2 to 2. Now, I know that does seem confusing because I just said we need to work in a range of 0 to 1 because we're working in UV space. And that's where something interesting comes in. Now, I'm actually not sure why this is, but as we all know, regular UV space is in the range of 0 to 1. But it seems like Copernicus is actually in a range of -1 to 1. And it's pretty easy to figure this out. And here's the reason why. If I come here and I type down SDF shape, and I'm going to switch this over, and now you do notice that the radius does say 1, but that also just means that it has a diameter of 2. And so a better way to actually see this would be to switch this over to rectangle. And we can see that this is actually set from 2 to 2 instead of what you would expect would be like 1, 1. And you would expect the size to be 1, 1 if you were in 0 to 1 space. But it's actually in 2 to 2. And so what that means is that we're actually working in -1 to 1 space. And so, like I said, I'm not sure why, but for whatever reason, Copernicus works in -1 to 1 space. And so if that's the case, then we also need to make sure that our grid matches this 2 to 2 size. And so to make that easier to understand, if we come here to the grid, and well, actually, I guess we're already on it. And then we come here, we can see that right here, we're actually working in -1 to 1 space by setting the grid to 2 to 2, because over here on the bottom left, we have -1, -1. Then up here on the top right, we have 1, 1. And so to illustrate this, I'm going to actually go back here and get rid of that. And let's do stamp points. So I'm going to bring this in right here. And so what it's doing right now is it's going to stamp a square on each of our points. And it's getting cut off at the range too. So like, since we're working in, what is it? What I already forgot. Since we're working in -1 to 1 space, anything that's outside of it will get cut. And so I'm going to go back in here. And if I were to set this to, and actually that brings up another thing. Let me go back here. I'm going to hit this pin button, and that's going to keep the viewport here. So when I go inside here, the viewport will still stay at the other level. So if I come here and I set this from 1 to 1, you can see that it's actually not filling up the whole image. And so that's just more proof that we're actually working in -1 to 1 space and not 0 to 1. And so if I come back here and I set this from 2 to 2, it actually is indeed filling up everything. But right now we want some random points, and right now it's just using the points on the grid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop down a scatter, and I'm going to connect that in, and I'm actually going to duplicate it. Now for this, it doesn't really matter if the points are overlapping. Actually, if anything, we want the points to overlap because we're going to want a whole bunch of cubes covering the whole area of this grid. And so now I'm going to come and I'm going to merge these together. And I'm going to actually just put down an output. And so that way we know that this node will always be used for the output of this network. And another thing, 2 more things that we're going to need. We're going to need to adjust the P scale, because that stamp node that we have out here can actually make use of a P scale attribute. So I'm going to put this to, let's just do random so that we get a random distribution. And then we're going to drop this down, and we can see that it's already starting to look really nice. And then the other thing that we wanted was an attribute adjust color. So I'm going to throw that down. And right now it's not actually doing anything. I think we just need to go change some of the settings. Constant. I think I'm just going to go random and then switch the ramp to black body. Well, no, not black body. We want grayscale. That's it. I was thinking white to black. That's what I was thinking. And let's take a look at these points. Now, I don't actually want them to be evenly distributed. So I'm going to put the relax iterations down to like 1 on the first scatter. Then I think on the second scatter, I'm just going to completely disable it because I don't really care. Like I said, we just want random shapes everywhere. And so I think I'm going to just put this up to some high number like 10,000. And then for this one, I'll probably just do 5,000. And so that's looking really good. But I think I think we're going to want some bigger shapes than that. So we can layer this on. So we're not just stuck with one level of detail, or one layer rather. So we can have multiple. I mean, and if anything, it's better to have more layers. So what we're going to do is we're going to create multiple layers and stack them together, and that's going to give us the best results. But for now, I'm going to go to the P scale, and I think I'm just going to go ahead and make the biggest size bigger. And instead of going all the way to 0, I probably just want the smallest one to still actually be showing. So I'll do like 0.05. I guess it's kind of hard to show that, to actually see what's happening. So I'll just put the max to that too, so we can actually see what the smallest one will be. So I think I'll make it just a little bit bigger for this level of detail anyway. So I think I'll go from 0.1 to, I forgot what we had before. I think it was like 0.6. No, maybe a little bit bigger. So like 1. Yeah, I think that would be good for this. All right, perfect. And so now we have exactly what we want. But I think for this right now, we're outputting RGBA. But since we're going to be using the black and white information only, and so we can actually, like, you may think, oh, we need RGB because we're doing color, but we're actually just going to derive a ramp from the black and white information. So the only thing that we really need is mono. And so I'm just going to go ahead and set that to mono. And before we do anything else, let's go ahead and just get the material preview set up so that we can actually see what this is going to look like. And so there's a really cool node for that. It's the preview material node. So let's go ahead and drop that down. And I like grid, that's what we want. And so right now, I didn't really, when I set this up, you can set up the color here, but I didn't even care about the color at this level. I only did the color and shading just because it's just like an extra step doing it here. And I was more concerned about the displacement. And then I did the color in the actual material network. So I'm going to output this mono information right there into the displacement. And I can already tell you that it's going to displace the grid way too much, but that's fine. So I'm going to take this stamp right here, and let's go ahead and plug it into, there should be a section for displacement. Here it is right here where it says height. And so now let's put the display flag on it, and you can see immediately that we have our displacement. And so we can already tell that the range is wrong because we want there to be negative values. So right now the noise is only positive. And so there's no noise, there's no position that's going in the negative direction. It's all just positive. And so we're going to fix that in a second. But now it is true, I didn't actually set up the color, but just to make it easier to see, I'll just output this as, I'll output the black and white information that we saw here into the actual base color. And so that'll make it easier to see. And now one of the most important nodes that we're going to constantly be using is the remap node. And this is going to allow us to remap the values. And so if we think about the colors that we outputted colors from black to white, which is giving us a range of 0 to 1, but we want to displace in both, as we said earlier, the negative and positive direction. So I'm going to switch this minimum to -1, and we can, if we go back here, we can see that now the noise is actually distributed evenly, going in both the positive and negative directions. But of course, this displacement is a little bit too much. So an easy way to control it, there's other things you could do, like you could put a multiply node, so you can multiply it by an amount that's, you can multiply it by like 0.1, but for the sake of simplicity or having less nodes, I guess I'd rather do for now, I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm going to hit paste relative references so that whatever we put here is going to go here, but we actually just want this to be the negative version of it. So I'm just going to do times -1. And that's going to fix that. And so now if I come here and I do 0.05, now we can see that it's looking a lot closer to what we want. And something else I want to point out is that from my experience, the displacement here doesn't exactly match what you get with Karma. And that makes perfect sense to me because they're different renderers. I think this is using Vulkan in the viewport. And then of course, when you're in Solaris, you're using Karma. So the displacement won't match perfectly, but that's not too bad. Like it was fairly close to me. And what I wound up doing was in the material, I would just change the scale of the displacement from like 1 to 2. So I think it was slightly less displaced in the actual render than it was here. So for the actual grid that we're using to render, we don't need a whole bunch of resolution because the displacement's happening at render time. But just for this actual preview grid, we do need a lot of divisions because it just won't look good in the viewport. But like I said, the actual grid that we're using to render, which was the grid that we created, where is it, back over here? We don't need much resolution on that one. But for this one, we do need some resolution, but they have a division section right here. So I'm just going to put this up to like 500. And we can see that this is instantly looking way better than what we had before. All right, so we have this first level of noise that we have, but I want to do another level. And so I want this to be higher frequency. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to, if you copy the nodes and you hit Alt and then you drag them, it'll actually duplicate them, which is really cool. So I'm just going to name this to secondary just so I can separate it out. And I'm going to put the display flag on this stamp right here. And so I'm going to go inside this geometry network, and let's just go ahead and change a few things. We're going to want a lot more points, and then we're going to also want smaller p scale values. So I'm just going to throw in random values until I get something that looks decent. That'll probably actually be good for the minimum. So I'm going to put the minimum to 0.05, and then we'll put the max to 0.2. And actually, now that I think about it, with all this small detail, I probably don't want it everywhere. So I'm actually probably going to use fewer points now I actually think about it. So I think I'm going to come drop down these just a little bit like that. And let's go ahead and blend these together. So this is another important thing to do. You're going to have all these noises, and so you're going to have to blend them together. So I think the nodes I wind up using the most are one, remap, as I said before. Then the other one is blend. And because, like I said, you're like in the actual scene, actually I can just bring it over. Because I have two monitors open, and I actually have like the actual like render that I showed at the beginning of the video was made using this. And so you can see I have like a blend right here when I'm blending that together. I have a blend there. I have a blend there. And so then I have like I said, remap there. So that those are like pretty much the most used nodes that we're going to be using. So let's go back to our actual scene over here. And I think what I'm going to do is actually going to right click here. Let's do a null. And I'm just going to move that out. And I'm going to move this further to the right so that we have some space to work with. Now we're not going to be recreating the render 100% just because it's just going to take way too much time. And you probably want to make your own thing anyway. So this is pretty much just going to cover the general concept of making the texture and then actually setting up the material. So we need to blend these two together. So I'm going to drop down a blend node. And did we set this? Oh, that's right. We copied it. So it's already on mono. Perfect. So I'm going to put these two together. I'm going to put this one in the foreground. And if we put the display flag on here, nothing's happening. And the reason why is because this is pretty much just going on top of it. The new layer that we have is pretty much going on top of it. But for this one, I think I actually I want two things to happen. Not only do I want this to go on top of the other one, but I want it to have a little bit of transparency to it. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second. And so right here, we have this mask right here, which allows us to use black and white information to control the transparency. So I'm going to drop down a remap node. And well, since this is already black and white information, that's perfect. So we're going to use that to drive the mask. And so as soon as we do that, we can see that all the black areas become transparent, and you now see the underlying pattern that we had there before. So this is perfect. But I still actually want to make these stamps transparent. So I'm going to go to the stamp alpha, and I'm going to switch this to like, I think 0.5. Yeah, and the reason why I'm doing that is because if you see where these squares overlap, it's going to create these nice, cool looking areas right here that you wouldn't get if it was just completely if it was 100% opaque. You wouldn't get these interesting areas right there that create really cool look in the displacement. It's hard to describe what it's doing now, but if you mess around with it and then actually see how it affects the render directly, it looks really cool. So now that we have that updated, let's go back here and put our display flag back on there. And so now we can see that we're getting all this really cool looking smaller details. Now, something that I am noticing is that Looks like a lot of there's a lot of stuff being carved in or getting pushed in instead of going out. So I think I'm gonna just adjust the remap a little bit. Oh wait, that's not the right one. I actually need to use another one. That was controlling opacity. I'll drop down another one. There we go. All right, I think I like that better because now there's not so much of it going in. There's more positive displacement than negative displacement. All right, nice. So for this material, we're going to be doing one more thing because it's important to also know how to directly rasterize geometry instead of just using these stamp points right here. So I'm going to copy this secondary and bring it out here. And I'm just going to name this circles. And let's put the display flag on that. And this time we're going to be, instead of just bringing in points, we're going to be bringing in actual geometry. So let's go inside here. And we don't need, let me see. Well, I guess we could still use the P scale and the color. So that's good. And we actually don't need the UV. And we'll see why in just a second. So for this one, I'm just going to do a scatter. I guess I could have just kept other scatter, but oh well. So I'm going to keep a scatter here, and then I'll just do a few of them like that. And what else can we do to make this interesting? So I guess we can copy a circle to each of these points. So we can do a copy to points. And then here is our circle. And let's bring all this stuff back in, connect that up. Nice. And I think I'm just going to adjust these values a little bit for smaller circles. And actually, I just had an idea. What if we... Okay, let me turn off this pin so that we actually go here and view what we're doing in here. So I think I'm actually going to switch this to a triangle. And so I'm going to switch that to a triangle. And then let's duplicate it and then hit revert to default. And then let's do copy to points. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy circles to the circle. Oh yeah, that's good. But I think these circles are just a little bit too big. So let's go ahead and bring those down. And then also let's bring that down a little bit too. And then let's put the display flag here. And so now we're copying a whole bunch of circles to the circles on the points. All right, this is looking cool. But I think I'm gonna give it some random rotation so that it's not all exactly the same. And we're gonna make sure that we have some, let's see, where's that thing called? Scatter and align. Yeah, I like using this tool. I think this is pretty good for doing this sort of thing. But I think the scatter and align, wait, where'd it go? Oh wait, yeah, that's right. I know what the issue is. It actually needs to go into the second one and then add attributes on existing point cloud. Okay, perfect. And so we can spin this around, but that's not exactly what we want. I think if we actually just give it a normal attribute, that'll work. So if I do normal and then connect this to the grid, yeah, that's starting to work. So let's see, let's do points instead. And then I think that the scatter copies the attributes from the grid. So yep, that's working perfectly. And let's go back to see what we're doing. Looks like that's facing the wrong way. We should be able to fix that right here with alignment, maybe X or Z. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Oh, there it is. Yeah, max angle. So now we can just switch the max angle. So now we're getting random rotations. Yeah, so I'm not copying exactly what I did in the other setup. So I'm actually having to figure this stuff out as I go. So it's not as streamlined as it could be, unfortunately. But that's looking a lot better. And I think I'm going to up this a little bit more. But then for these relax iterations, like I said, I don't want the spacing to be too perfect. Otherwise, it starts looking really uniform, and I don't like that. So I think this is a lot better than what we had before. So if we go back to the COPnet, we can see that we have our geometry here, but we actually need to rasterize this. So there's a few nodes that we need. The first one is rasterize setup, and this is going to set up a few things that we need to actually rasterize the geometry. So then the other one is rasterize geometry. And so let's put the display flag on here. Nice, and it's working correctly. It's working because, like I said, we were already in the correct space of -1 to 1. So when we bring it in here, it's automatically working, which is perfect. And so now I want to add this on top of the other one. And so again, we're going to use a blend. And this time we'll plug that in. But instead of doing, so I want to set this to maximum. And so let's put that to maximum and put the display flag on it. And now we can see that we have these circles on top. So let's go back to the preview material. And yep, now we can see those circles right there. I think the circles, they're being displaced a little bit too much. And so once again, we're going to need another remap node. So let's bring in the remap node. And let's see, let's change this. Oh wait, not that one. This one, there we go. So I think I'm just gonna put this to 0.5. Well, actually, let's go 0.65. That looks a little bit better. All right, perfect. And so now we're almost ready to set up the material, but there's a few things that we need to do. We're going to create some nulls that allow us to easily get these textures. So that's one of the cool things about working in COPernicus is that we can, or actually I guess Houdini in general, is that we can actually grab, instead of having to save these out the textures, we can actually just grab information from the nodes instead. So for example, this is going to be used as our displacement map. So I'm going to drop down a null, connect that up, and I'm going to name this out displace, or actually I'm just going to name it disp for short. And so that's going to be our displacement out. And then the base color, we actually don't need, this doesn't need to be remapped at all like this one. So I'm going to drop down another null. Actually, we already have the null right here. So we can use this one right here. So I'm going to do out, and I'm just going to call it base because that's just like the base level, or the, actually that's not good. Well, I'm going to call it out diffuse or something. I don't know. It doesn't matter. So I'm just going to call it that. And then as I was saying earlier, if there's something that we want specific control over, we need to export that out as well. And so I want to export out these circles because I'm going to give them a different color than the rest of everything else. So I'm going to drop down another null. And something else to note too is that you need to make sure whether or not you actually want the remapping to apply to this. And so since I want these to actually just be fully white, I don't want the remapping that's being applied here onto it, because this is actually bringing the maximum to 0.65, but I don't want that for the color. For the color, I want this to be from a full range of 0 to 1. So I'm going to name this out and then dots. And I think that's all the information that we have, or that's all the information that we need in order to render this material. So I'm going to, let me just look at this one more time to make sure that this is what we want. And something else cool that they have here is you can actually switch this to other things. So you can switch it to a sphere and see how it looks on that. And I think the one that I like best is the torus. I don't know why. I just think it's weird seeing like these sci-fi textures on a torus. And you can actually import your own geometry and plug it in right there. So I can show how to do that. So if you bring in a SOP import, like the reason why I'm showing you how to do this is because like if you're actually designing this material for a very specific object, and so you'd probably want to actually preview the material on that object. So just like any other operation that involves SOPs in COPernicus, we can just use a SOP import. And then I'm going to do rubber toy because this is undoubtedly the best test geometry that Houdini's ever made. Sorry, just don't tell Tommy or Capybara or all the other ones. But yes, the rubber toy is indeed the best. So I'm going to put the display flag on that. And well, actually, I don't need to do that. I can keep it on here. But instead, I'm going to plug this into the geometry. And you also, of course, need to make sure that geometry that you're bringing in has UVs. And so otherwise, it won't work properly, of course, because this is texturing. So you need UVs for that. But this is the end of this step. And so in the next step, we're going to be actually setting up the materials and the render in Solaris. All right, we're back in Solaris. So I switched my workspace back over to the Solaris workspace just to make things a little bit easier. And I'm going to go ahead and just turn on the viewport or the render. So I'm going to go to Karma XPU just so that we can get the render started right there. And I'm just going to work while that's running. And I'm just going to pin the viewport just to make sure that it doesn't accidentally move to another location. So what I'm going to do just to make the first one easier is I'm going to go into the COPnet, and I'm just where it says out diffuse, I'm just going to copy that node by hitting Control C. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to go to the material. Let me just move that stuff down. And so let's focus on just doing the color first. So we need to bring in that image. And so I'm going to drop down an image node. Is it called, what is it called? Is it file or texture? I always forget because everything always has the, every program always has its own name. Okay, so it's image. So material X image. And we need to bring in that node. And so we can actually just do that by hitting Control V, and that will bring in that node. And it's not going to work at first. And the reason why is because we just need to put OP. I believe that just stands for operator, so that it knows the data is from a node and not a texture file or not an actual file. And so once I do that, it'll actually start working. And let me take this out. I'm going to plug it into the base color. And so, yeah, we can tell that actually is working. And I'm going to just hide the grid, and I'm going to hit D to bring up the background or to bring up the display options. And I'm just going to turn the color scheme to dark just because I think it's easier to work that way. And let's see, what else we're going to do. We're going to actually give this color. So let me cut that connection that we just made. And I'm going to make a ramp. So I'm going to type in ramp here, and I'm just going to do ramp constant. And let's bring in, actually, I think that's good enough. We can just use the colors for remapping. And so, yeah, signature vector is fine. And I think the reason why this line is dotted instead of solid is because the signature is technically color, but the ramp is looking for a float. It doesn't really matter, but you can just switch this to float if you want. And so now that's working as it's intended, or as it wants you to work. And so now I'm going to plug the base color into color. And now we're starting to get somewhere. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to move this up because I don't want, it's way too bright by default. So let's do that. And then actually, I think I'm going to actually just bring it a little bit even further like that. And let's see, instead of white, probably want some other color. I think for this one, I'm just going to do purple just because I already did red and blue in the other one. So I just want to try something else. And so that's looking good, but we're also going to use this information to control the emission so that it gets bright. And let's see, I think there's too much of our light, so I'm going to put this down to like 0.3. I'll probably put it to 0.4. It also won't look as bad once the displacement's actually on. And something else I wanted to point out is that for some reason, if you use the displacement from a node in the way that you're doing here instead of a file, whenever you make an update to the material, it becomes insanely slow. So what I would recommend doing is if you have your displacement on, I would just cut the wire from the texture. I'll just show you when I get to it rather than try to explain it here. But for now, let's go ahead and set up the emission. So I'm gonna copy this. Now you could just use the wire from that one, but in my actual scene, things got really messy. So I'm just going to separate this out, even though it's getting the exact same information. And we're going to use, let's see, what is it? Range, material X range. Perfect. So I'm going to plug that into here. And so this one is going to go into the emission. So this is going to control the actual like emission value. So I'm going to just make a few, actually, instead of using that, let's actually go ahead and use a ramp because I think that's easier to work with. So I'm just going to do a ramp similar to what we did before, but I'm going to switch this over to float instead. And now I'm just going to move this back over here a little bit. And now we actually need to control the color. And so we can duplicate this ramp, but switch this over to vector so that we actually have color, and then swap this into the emission color. And then let's go here and copy this color. And then I'm going to paste it in this ramp right here for this color right there. Nice. And I think The one thing that I do want to change though is that this value, I'm going to make it a little bit higher just so that it gets brighter. I think I'm going to overdrive it a little bit. I'm going to go to like 2.5 just so it gets really bright. And I think I'm going to lower the saturation. Yeah, there we go. Lower the saturation a bit. And so now I'm going to talk about the issue I was talking about before. So let's bring in the displacement. And so we can just bring in another image. So material X image. And let's go ahead and copy this. Now we do need another map, but the reason why I'm copying it is because it just makes it easier, because you can just come here and now it'll show all the other maps that you have. So I'm going to do displacement because that's the one that we want. And displacement is black and white information. So we can set the signature to be float. And now I can plug this in wait a sec. And so now we can see that it's being displaced. And if you remember what I said earlier, it looks like it's not, the displacement that's happening here isn't quite as, it doesn't quite match what we had in the Vulkan viewport. So I'm just going to up the scale a little bit just to get something that I want that looks a little bit better. I think for this one, I'm just going to do 3. You can do whatever you want. And also the quality may not look super great with the displacement. And that's just because if you remember earlier, we set the dicing quality to 0.5 just for the sake of it being fast. And so now here's the thing that's kind of annoying. So if I come here let me go to this right here. And if I switch the color to blue, oh, of course now it's working quickly. But when I was working the other day, it was not updating quickly when I was using information from a node. So what I was doing is I was either just saving out the image or for the displacement and loading it, or the other thing that I did was I would just cut this wire and then I would go in and then change the color. And then once I got that working, then I would plug this back in. But it seems to be working now. So I guess that's good. And something else I'm going to do really quickly, just to make it look a little bit better, is I'm going to enable the slap comp just so I can add some post-processing just to add a little bit of a glow. And so before I do that, let's go to the render settings, and I'm going to go to the image planes, and let's go ahead and enable the combined emission AOV. And so if we switch this over, we can see that right here, this is just the AOV that has all of the emission by itself. And we're going to use that for glow in our slap comp. So I'm just going to do this in a separate COPnet just to keep everything separate. And I'm just going to name this post because it'll have our post processing applied to it. And so now I'm going to type in slap comp. I love this. This is like one of my favorite features of Houdini 20.5. And so now I'm going to hit add AOVs from last render. And so that's going to grab that emission AOV that we had there, and we don't need the depth, so I'm just going to cut that. And let's drop down a glow. And for the source, I'm going to grab the combined emission instead of the color, but then we need to actually blend that back. Like I said, you wind up using the blend node for literally everything. So I'm going to put the color into the foreground and then blend this back. And let's see, what are we doing here for the output glow only? Yeah, I'm just going to do output glow only. And then what is this? This is RGB. That's RGBA. Okay, that'll be fine. So I'm going to set this to add because I want it to be additive. And then we actually need to turn it on. So let's put the display flag there and then click this right there to actually turn on to enable the slap comp. This is a little bit much, so I'm just going to change this a little bit. I'm going to change the threshold and just play with these settings a bit. Yep, that's good for now. And also, let's just add some depth of field just because I can. Let's see, let's go to sampling and then set this to like 0. I think probably like 0.2 will be good. It might be a little bit much. Oh wait, I went the wrong way. 0.3, that's better. Maybe 0.35, there we go. And something cool that you can do is if you select the camera and you hit enter and then hit Shift F, that brings up this focus plane. And then if you hit Shift S, if you hit Shift and then click, you can actually drag it around. And I have no idea why. For some reason, it seems to be kind of glitchy at times. Let me do that again. All right, Shift F. Yeah, if it doesn't work, like now let me actually, for some reason, like when it says hit Shift. Yeah, there we go. Now it's working. It says hit Shift and then click to set the focus distance. For some reason, it seems to not work. So if it doesn't work, usually what I do is I just come to the distance and then I just move it here manually. Then once I do that, then it starts working in here. But yeah, this makes it really easy to set the actual focus distance that you're going to need. And like I said, I think I can just put this a little bit higher just because it's like super blurry and it's kind of hard to see. But yeah, that's a lot better. And so I think we're mostly there, but the one thing that I did want to do was I wanted to add a different color for the circle. So let's go figure out how to do that. So let's go back into the material really quickly. And I just got to pull it up on my other screen so I can see what I did. So we need to bring in that circle texture that we did. So let's bring in another material. Or another texture rather. So I'm going to do image. And again, I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to paste it in here. But instead of the diffuse, we want the dots because that's going to be our circle. And so there are two things. We need to mix this with two things. We need to mix the color and we need to mix the alpha with this one. So just to make it easier, I'm going to name this color ramp, or I'm going to name this glow color, and then I'm going to name this glow alpha. And that's going to make it easier just so that we can differentiate the two. And then for this, I'll just name it dots. And so now let's copy these two. And I'm going to plug those into there. And I'm going to switch this to float as well. And so for this one, I'll just name it glow dots color. And then glow dots alpha. So now I know those are, I can distinguish those two. So now we need to mix the alpha together. And so this one is a simple operation. It's just going to be a material X max. And the reason why is because we need the values to be between 0 and 1. And so if you have a value of 1 from this map and a value of 1 for this map, it's just going to be the maximum of the two. So you won't get any values outside of 0 and 1, or given that that's what you're actually providing. So this is the alpha. And so then we need the alpha from here. So let's plug that in. And so immediately we see a change. And if you ever see this compile, usually it's just best to wait for that compile to do what it needs before making another change. All right. So now let's actually separate the color, or do the different color for the dots and then mix those together. So for actually mixing the color, we're going to use a color mix, or we're going to use a mix node. I think it's material X mix. And then if you plug this in, it should automatically switch it to color. Yeah, signature. Well, actually, it did switch to vector, but that's fine. I'll just do color. And then I'll plug this color in for the background. And I think that the reason why it looks weird is because it actually needs to be inverted, or not inverted, but I need to put this one into the background. So if you click the node and hit Shift R, that will switch the inputs. And so now it's back to how it was before, but we never actually changed the color here. So let's go here and let's see what goes well with purple. Well, I guess I'll just go opposite the color wheel. Let me try green or something. Oh, let's see, green. And it's not working. So let's see what's going on. For now, let me plug this color directly into the mission color to see what's happening. Okay, so that is working. So something's happening. Something's wrong in our mix. Oh, wait. I didn't actually plug anything into the mix. I forgot about that. That's my mistake. So we have these two things mixed together, but it's only using one of the inputs. So we need to actually put something into the mix to make sure that we're actually mixing between the two. And so that'll actually be simple to do. I don't even need to use a remap, I don't think. So I'm just going to take this wire and then I'm going to hit Alt to create a dot, and then I'm going to put that into the mix. And then as soon as I do that, it should start working. It looks like the render's not updating, so I might just go here and hit restart. All right, there we go. Now it's working. Yeah, it was just a bit glitchy before, but usually whenever it's having a hard time updating, if restart doesn't work, I'll just switch to the Vulkan viewport and then go back to the XPU or CPU, whatever I'm using, and then it'll start working. So yep, I just forgotten to put the mix in, but once you do that, now it should actually start working. And you can see that's why it's probably a good idea to rename these nodes, because once you start mixing all these together, it starts getting really confusing. This is the actual render that I did in the material. You can see I have all these nodes together, and so it kind of starts getting confusing. I don't really like green, to be honest. I think it's a terrible color. Let me just try something else. I'm gonna try blue. And let me just set the value to like 3. Yeah, I think that's a lot better. So this is starting to look really cool, but I do want to actually preview it with better displacement. And so you can see that the displacement quality is kind of trashy. So let's go back to that original node, one of the original nodes we set up, which is a render geometry setting. And I'm going to switch this dicing quality to 1. And just something I want to point out is that if you make a change like that and you don't actually see any difference, it's probably because you need to restart the render. So I'm just going to hit restart, and that'll force the displacement to recalculate. So actually, let me bring up this right here. Let me set this to like 0.2. And I'm just going to save a snapshot. And then let me put this to a higher value. Let me just put this to 1. Looks like it didn't actually update. I'll take another snapshot. I just want to compare these two together. Oh yeah, you can definitely tell that it's looking a lot better. Now something else I'm going to do, I think the actual resolution is pretty low. I don't know if that'll make a difference since we're getting data from the node, but I'll just go ahead and change it just to make sure. But right now the resolution isn't set, but I'm just going to go ahead and set this to like 4K. And let me actually make sure the node is cooking. Yeah, I found it's kind of it's glitchy sometimes. So sometimes I have to like disable and re-enable the nodes to make sure it's actually cooking properly. But yeah, that's pretty much the setup. Now, I didn't really spend a lot of time making this look good, but let me bring over the other project really quickly. Now here's the Houdini project from my original render. As you can see, this looks a lot better than the other render that I had up, but that's because I spent a whole bunch of time actually going through and adding different levels of detail and then refining the look over the course of multiple iterations. But just to show you again what that sort of looks like. Oops, that's the wrong one. Let me actually go into the COP network. So this is the actual COP network for the material. And let me switch that back to grid. But yeah, so that's what this looks like. So you can see that I just have multiple iterations of detail just all being added on top of each other. And that's pretty much all this is. It's just taking whatever shapes or even photos or images that you want, and then just like tiling it, repeating it in some way, adding it on top of other ones, and then just refining it till you get what you want. But yep, that's pretty much it for this tutorial.